Sarah Miller clutched her worn purse tightly as the law firm's receptionist looked her up and down. The woman's eyes lingered on Sarah's faded dress and scuffed shoes before she forced a tight smile. "Mr. Daniels, we'll see you now," she said, gesturing toward the large oak door at the end of the hallway. Sarah took a deep breath and walked forward, ignoring the whispers that followed her. It had been 5 years since she'd set foot in Westfield, the small New England town where she'd grown up. 5 years since her father had made it clear she wasn't welcome anymore. Now George Miller was dead, and somehow Sarah had been included in the will reading. Probably a few old books or a token piece of jewelry. Nothing that would matter to her wealthy half-brother James, who had taken control of Miller Industries long ago. The conference room fell silent as she entered. 8 pairs of eyes turned to stare at her. Relatives, business associates, and childhood neighbors, all dressed in expensive clothes that made her simple outfit look even shabbier. "Well, look who decided to show up," James said from his seat at the head of the table. "We thought you were still off in Boston playing secretary." Sarah's cheeks burned, but she kept her face neutral. "Hello, James. I'm an administrative director now." "At a charity that pays you what, $30,000 a year?" He laughed. Dad must be rolling in his grave. A middle-aged man in a gray suit cleared his throat. "If we could begin, I'm Walter Green, Mr. Miller's attorney." He gestured to an empty chair in the corner. "Please have a seat, Ms. Miller." Sarah sat down, trying to ignore how everyone had shifted slightly away from her, as if her outsider status might be contagious. At 38, she'd built a life for herself after the accident that had changed everything. The head injury had left her with processing difficulties that her family had mistaken for intellectual disability. Rather than fight their assumptions, she'd moved away and started over. Mr. Green began reading the will, distributing George Miller's personal items methodically. James received their father's vintage car collection. Their cousin Peter got the vacation home in Maine. Their Aunt Martha inherited the art collection. Sarah sat quietly, waiting for her small bequest so she could leave and catch the afternoon bus back to Boston. She had patients waiting at the therapeutic riding center where she worked. "And to my daughter Sarah," Mr. Green read, pausing to adjust his glasses, "I leave my collection of bird-watching journals and field guides." James snickered. How fitting. Dad's useless hobby goes to his useless daughter. "James," his wife Ellen hissed, but she was smiling too. Sarah nodded, her face burning with humiliation. The journals meant something to her, days spent with her father in the woods before the accident, before everything changed. But the public dismissal stung. "If that's all," she said quietly, gathering her purse, "I should catch my bus." "Actually, Ms. Miller," Mr. Green said, shuffling through his papers, "there's a final section added to your father's will just 3 weeks before his passing." James straightened in his chair. "What final section? I reviewed the will with Dad months ago." "This codicil was executed privately," the lawyer explained, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Mr. Miller was very specific about how this portion should be handled." Sarah sat back down, confusion replacing embarrassment. The room grew tense as Mr. Green broke the seal and began reading. "Regarding the controlling interest in Miller Industries, all associated properties, patents, and financial accounts." James leaned forward, his expression confident. He'd been running the company for years, ever since convincing their father that Sarah's accident had left her incapable of business decisions. "I leave the entirety of these assets, valued at approximately $62 million, to my daughter, Sarah Miller." The silence was absolute. Sarah felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. She must have misheard. "This is ridiculous." James slammed his fist on the table. "She can't even balance her own checkbook. She'll destroy everything Dad built." "That's not possible," Ellen said, her face pale. "Sarah signed away her rights to the company after her accident. I saw the papers myself." Mr. Green cleared his throat. The documents Mrs. Miller is referring to were reviewed by independent counsel and found to be signed under duress, while Ms. Sarah Miller was still recovering from traumatic brain injury and not legally competent to make such decisions. Sarah's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. She remembered those days after the accident, the confusion, the headaches, the way James and her stepmother had pushed papers in front of her while she was still on pain medication. "My father would never do this," James insisted, standing now. "He told me repeatedly that Sarah wasn't capable of running a business. He must have been confused near the end." "On the contrary," Mr. Green replied, producing another document. "Mr. Miller underwent a complete cognitive assessment before making these changes. The physician's statement confirms he was of sound mind and body." Ellen turned to Sarah, her pleasant mask slipping to reveal naked contempt. "This is your doing, isn't it? You manipulated a sick old man, got him to feel sorry for you with your pathetic little charity job and your bus rides." "I haven't spoken to my father in 5 years," Sarah said quietly. "Not since James told him I was trying to borrow money." "Because you were," James shouted. "I was trying to repay what I'd borrowed for medical school, the degree I never got to finish after the accident." Sarah's voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "The money I'd been promised." An older woman at the far end of the table, Margaret Wilson, her father's longtime assistant, spoke up. "Mr. Miller discovered some concerning information in the months before his passing. He spent considerable time reviewing company records from the past decade." James's face flushed. "Margaret, that's enough." "There's more to the codicil," Mr. Green continued. "Mr. Miller has left specific instructions regarding the transition of power. Sarah Miller is to assume the role of CEO immediately, with a 3-person advisory board consisting of Margaret Wilson, David Chen from finance, and Thomas Elliott from legal to assist during the first year." Sarah felt lightheaded. Her father had planned this carefully, but why? After years of believing she was incapable, what had changed his mind? "This is a mistake," James said, his voice calmer now as he addressed the room. "My sister suffered a traumatic brain injury 15 years ago. She has cognitive deficits that make it impossible for her to run a company. I'm only trying to protect her and Dad's legacy." He turned to Sarah with practiced concern. "Sis, you know you can't handle this. The stress alone would be dangerous for someone in your condition. Sign the company over to me, and I'll make sure you're taken care of for life. A nice house, a car with a driver, anything you want." Sarah studied her half-brother's face. The same expression of false concern she'd seen when he'd convinced their father she couldn't possibly return to medical school, couldn't work at the company, couldn't manage her own inheritance. "My condition," she said carefully, "includes difficulty with processing speed and occasional word retrieval issues. It does not affect my intelligence, judgment, or ability to understand complex concepts." "Sarah," Ellen cut in with poisonous sweetness, "we all remember the doctor's reports. You can barely function independently." "Those reports were from immediately after the accident," Margaret interjected, sliding a folder across the table. "These are Ms. Miller's evaluations from the past 3 years, commissioned by her father without her knowledge. They show remarkable recovery and adaptation. Her analytical skills actually test in the 93rd percentile." Sarah stared at Margaret in shock. Her father had been having her evaluated for years. "Additionally," Mr. Green added, "Mr. Miller left this for you, Ms. Miller." He handed her a sealed envelope with her name written in her father's distinctive handwriting. Sarah opened it with trembling fingers and pulled out a handwritten letter. "Sarah, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I have made many mistakes in my life, but none greater than allowing others to convince me of your limitations. I have watched from a distance as you built a life of purpose and dignity, despite everything being taken from you. 3 months ago, I discovered financial irregularities at Miller Industries dating back to shortly after your accident. The evidence suggests your brother has been systematically embezzling funds and selling proprietary technology to competitors. This flash drive contains everything you'll need. I was a fool to trust him over you. I hope this inheritance provides some measure of justice, though it cannot return the years that were taken from you. The company is yours not out of pity, but because you are the only miller with the integrity to lead it. With love and regret, Dad Sarah looked up from the letter to find James watching her with calculated intensity. He didn't know what the letter contained, but the flash drive her father mentioned was clipped to the back page. Whatever was on it had been enough to change everything. I need time to process this, she said, carefully returning the letter to its envelope. Of course you do, James said smoothly. Take all the time you need. Meanwhile, I can continue running things as usual. Mr. Green shook his head. I'm afraid that won't be possible. Effective immediately, all executive decisions require Ms. Miller's approval, and all company accounts now require her signature. James's composure finally cracked. This is insane. She's not capable. Everyone in this room knows it. Actually, Sarah said, rising to her feet, everyone in this room has been told I'm not capable. There's a difference. She turned to Mr. Green. I'd like to schedule a full briefing on the company's current status for tomorrow morning. As chaos erupted around her, with James threatening lawsuits and Ellen nearly in tears, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. For 15 years, she'd accepted others' definition of her limitations. Now, with her father's final act, she had the chance to redefine herself and reclaim everything that had been taken from her. Outside the law firm, standing in the sunlight of the town that had once been home, Sarah took a deep breath. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with battles both legal and personal. But for the first time in 15 years, she wasn't facing it alone. Her father had finally believed in her. Now it was time to believe in herself. Sarah Miller sat alone in her father's office the next morning, surrounded by the trappings of a life she'd been excluded from. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and framed photos of her father with celebrities and politicians covered the walls. Not a single picture of her. She ran her fingers along the smooth surface of his desk, still struggling to believe this space was now hers. The Miller Industries headquarters occupied a 12-story building in downtown Westfield, a monument to her family's success that had always felt as unreachable as the moon. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Margaret Wilson entered, carrying a thick folder and a laptop. At 62, Margaret had been her father's executive assistant for over 30 years. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her expression professional but kind. "The executive team will be ready in the main conference room in 15 minutes, Margaret said. "I've prepared a summary of our current projects and financial status." "Thank you," Sarah replied, taking the folder. "I have a feeling they're expecting me to fail spectacularly today." Margaret's expression softened. "Your father knew this wouldn't be easy. That's why he put the advisory board in place. Why didn't he tell me what he'd discovered about James? Why wait until after his death?" "He was gathering evidence," Margaret explained. "And I think he was ashamed. Admitting he'd been wrong about you meant admitting he'd wasted 15 years believing lies." Sarah nodded, then opened her purse and removed the flash drive her father had left her. "I haven't looked at this yet. I was afraid to see it alone." Margaret connected the drive to the laptop. "I'll stay with you." For the next 10 minutes, they scrolled through document after document, financial records showing millions siphoned into offshore accounts, emails between James and competitors discussing the sale of proprietary technology, and most damning of all, medical reports about Sarah that had been altered before being presented to their father. "He changed the doctor's assessments," Sarah whispered, staring at side-by-side comparisons of original reports and the versions her father had seen, where her doctors had written about significant improvement and high functioning with specific deficits. James had substituted phrases like minimal improvement and requires ongoing supervision. "Your father discovered the original reports in the hospital archives when he was diagnosed with cancer." Margaret said quietly. That's what started his investigation. Sarah felt a wave of grief. He never told me he was sick. He didn't tell anyone until it was too late for treatment. He spent his final months putting these pieces together instead. The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Miller, the executive team is assembled," said a voice Sarah didn't recognize. She took a deep breath. It's time. Walking into the conference room felt like stepping onto a stage unprepared. 8 people sat around a long table, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. James sat at the far end, his posture relaxed as if he were still in charge. "Thank you all for coming," Sarah began, taking the seat at the head of the table. She noticed how several executives glanced at James before nodding to her. Their loyalty was clear. "I know this transition comes as a surprise," she continued. "I want to assure you that I have no intention of making sudden changes without understanding the company's current position." James leaned forward. "Why don't I give everyone an update on our quarterly projections? Then Sarah can ask questions if anything isn't clear." The condescension in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Before Sarah could respond, the door opened and a tall, athletic woman in her mid-40s entered. "I apologize for being late," she said. "Boston traffic." "Everyone, this is Dr. Rachel Thompson," Sarah said. "She'll be joining us today as my personal advisor." Sarah watched James's confident smile falter. Rachel had been her rehabilitation therapist after the accident, but she was also a respected neuropsychologist who specialized in executive function and business leadership. "Dr. Thompson?" James said carefully. "I wasn't aware we needed medical consultation for a business meeting." "I'm here in my capacity as a cognitive specialist," Rachel replied smoothly, taking a seat beside Sarah, "to ensure that information is presented in an accessible way for everyone at the table." It was a strategic move Sarah had planned the night before. Rachel's presence made it impossible for James to use technical jargon to confuse her, or to later claim she hadn't understood what she was agreeing to. "Let's begin with the financial overview," Sarah said, opening the folder Margaret had prepared. For the next 2 hours, Sarah listened more than she spoke, asking pointed questions about discrepancies between the numbers in her father's private records and what was being presented. Each time James tried to brush off her concerns, she pressed harder. "I'm particularly interested in Project Horizon," she said, referring to a development initiative she'd discovered in the files. "The R&D budget shows $8 million allocated, but there's no mention of it in today's presentation." The room grew quiet. The CFO, a nervous man named Howard Phillips, looked to James before responding. "Project Horizon was restructured," Howard said carefully. "The technology wasn't developing as expected, so we licensed certain components to Versatech Industries." "Versatech," Sarah repeated. "Our biggest competitor. That's interesting, because according to these patents filed 6 months ago, Versatech is now using technology remarkably similar to what we were developing." James's face hardened. "We were compensated fairly for those licenses." "I'd like to see the licensing agreement," Sarah said, "and the board minutes approving the deal." "Certainly," James replied too quickly. "I'll have those sent over. Now, about the expansion into Asian markets." "Actually," Sarah interrupted, "I'd like those documents now. Howard, could you pull them up on the server?" Howard paled. I don't have direct access to those files." "I do," Margaret said from her position near the door. She moved to the computer at the side of the room and began typing. James stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. We have a full agenda to cover today." "James," Sarah said calmly, "please sit down or leave. This meeting will continue either way." The executives exchanged glances, clearly shocked by the confrontation. James remained standing for several seconds, then slowly sat back down, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. "I can't find the licensing agreement in our system," Margaret announced, "but I did find these emails discussing the deal." She projected an email chain onto the screen at the front of the room. The emails were between James and Versatech's CEO, discussing not a licensing agreement, but an outright sale of the technology, with payment directed to a private account rather than to Miller Industries. That's taken completely out of context, James snapped. Those were preliminary discussions. Then you won't mind providing the final agreement, Sarah replied, and explaining why preliminary discussions involved a personal payment of $2 million to an account in the Cayman Islands. The room fell silent as the executives absorbed the implications. Sarah could see the moment when doubt crept into their expressions. Not doubt about her capabilities, but about James's integrity. "I think," said Thomas Elliott, the company's legal counsel and one of Sarah's advisory board members, "we should take a short break. James, I'd like to speak with you privately." As people filed out of the room, Dr. Thompson leaned close to Sarah. "You're doing well. How are you feeling?" "Like I'm walking through a minefield," Sarah admitted, "but at least now I know where some of the mines are." During the break, Sarah retreated to a small office Margaret had prepared for her. She was reviewing more documents when a soft knock came at the door. David Chen, the finance director and another advisory board member, entered looking troubled. In his 50s with salt and pepper hair, he had the serious demeanor of someone who took numbers very personally. "Ms. Miller, I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I've been reviewing the financial records your father flagged, and the irregularities go deeper than I realized. Transactions were hidden in ways that bypassed our normal oversight." "Did you suspect anything before now?" Sarah asked. David hesitated. "There were questions I didn't push hard enough on. Your brother can be intimidating when challenged. And you assumed my father was aware of everything." "Yes," he admitted. "I should have done more." Before Sarah could respond, Margaret hurried in. "James is leaving the building with his assistant. They're carrying files." Sarah moved quickly, David and Margaret following as she took the executive elevator to the ground floor. They reached the lobby just as James was striding toward the exit, his assistant struggling with a heavy box behind him. "Security," Sarah called to the uniformed guard at the front desk. "Please stop Mr. Miller and Ms. Parker from leaving with company property." James turned, his face flushed with anger. "You have no right." "I have every right," Sarah interrupted. "As of yesterday, I'm CEO of this company, and those files are not leaving this building." A small crowd had gathered, employees watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. James glanced around, clearly calculating how this would look. "These are personal items," he insisted. "Family photos, mementos." "Then you won't mind if security verifies that," Sarah replied. James stared at her for a long moment, then set down his briefcase with exaggerated care. "Take a look," he said to the security guard. "You'll find nothing but personal effects." The guard opened the briefcase and immediately pulled out several folders marked "Confidential," "Project Horizon." "Family photos?" Sarah asked quietly. James's composure broke. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything I've built? You're still the same damaged, slow-thinking burden you've always been. The board will never accept you." "The board," said a deep voice from behind them, "will have to evaluate new information." Robert Hastings, chairman of the board of directors, stepped forward from the crowd. In his 70s and impeccably dressed, he had been Sarah's father's closest friend. "Robert," James said, his tone instantly shifting to respectful concern. "I'm glad you're here. Sarah is clearly overwhelmed by this responsibility. She doesn't understand how things work." "I understand embezzlement and corporate espionage," Sarah said clearly, addressing not just Robert but the gathered employees. "I understand that while I was rebuilding my life, believing I wasn't capable of more, my brother was stealing from this company and undermining my recovery." She turned to James. "The altered medical reports, James. That was cruel even for you." Confusion crossed Robert's face. "What altered reports?" "We should discuss this privately," James insisted. "No more secrets," Sarah replied. "Dad kept this quiet to protect the company's reputation, but I won't let you continue using shame and secrecy as weapons." She looked at the gathering of employees. "For 15 years, you've been told I couldn't be trusted with responsibility because of brain damage from an accident. What you weren't told is that my recovery exceeded all medical expectations. My cognitive abilities are different, not lesser. And my brother deliberately misrepresented my condition to push me out." James's face twisted with rage. "You ungrateful—" "Security," Sarah interrupted. "Please escort Mr. Miller to his office to collect his actual personal belongings. Thomas from legal will supervise. Mr. Miller's access to company systems is revoked effective immediately." As James was led away, still protesting, Robert Hastings stepped closer to Sarah. "Your father called me the week before he died," he said quietly. "He told me changes were coming but wouldn't elaborate. I see now what he meant." "There's a lot to explain," Sarah said, "and a lot of damage to repair." Robert studied her face. "You're different from the woman I remember. Stronger." "I've always been strong," Sarah replied. "I just needed someone to see it." Later that evening, Sarah sat alone in her her office, reviewing the day's events. The executive team had rallied once James's deceptions began to emerge. The board was scheduling an emergency meeting. The company's legal team was preparing for the possibility of criminal charges. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk, where Margaret had told her George kept personal items. Inside was a small wooden box. Sarah lifted the lid to find photographs, dozens of them. Her graduation from college, her first apartment, her at the therapeutic riding center with her patients. Her father had been watching over her all along, too proud or too ashamed to reach out directly, and in the end, he had given her back everything that had been taken from her, not just the company, but her rightful place in the world he'd built. Sarah placed the pictures carefully back in the box. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, restructuring the company, rebuilding trust with employees and clients, preparing for the legal battles James would surely wage. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment to feel the weight of truth, finally set free after 15 years of lies. As she gazed out the window at the lights of Westfield below, Sarah realized she was no longer the woman who had stepped off a bus yesterday, ready to accept whatever small token her father had left her. That woman had lived within the boundaries others had drawn for her. This woman, the CEO of Miller Industries, the daughter George Miller had finally recognized, would draw her own boundaries from now on. 1 month into her new role as CEO, Sarah stood before a full-length mirror in her father's house, her house now, wondering if she still looked like an imposter. The tailored navy suit and modest pearl earrings were worlds away from the practical clothes she'd worn at the therapeutic riding center. Her hair, once pulled back in a simple ponytail, now fell in soft waves around her face. "You look perfectly capable of terrifying a boardroom," said Rachel Thompson, sitting on the edge of the bed. Their professional relationship had evolved into friendship over the difficult weeks following the will reading. "That's not what I'm going for," Sarah replied with a small smile. "No? Then why did Howard from finance practically run the other way when he saw you in the hallway yesterday?" Sarah sighed. "Because I questioned his budget projections for the 3rd time. The numbers still don't add up, and I can't tell if he's hiding something or just incompetent." "Or if he's still loyal to James," Rachel pointed out. That was the challenge Sarah faced daily, determining who could be trusted and who still reported to her brother. James had spent years building alliances within the company. Those relationships wouldn't disappear overnight. "The board meeting starts in an hour," Sarah said, checking her watch. "Robert wants me there early to review the legal strategy." James had filed a lawsuit contesting their father's will on grounds of undue influence and Sarah's mental incapacity. The case was weak, especially with the evidence of James's financial crimes mounting daily. But the public allegations had stirred up painful memories for Sarah and raised questions among Miller Industries clients and investors. 30 minutes later, Sarah walked into the company's main conference room, where Robert Hastings was already waiting with Thomas Elliot. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, setting down the briefcase Margaret had given her, a beautiful leather piece that had belonged to her father. "Sarah," Robert greeted her warmly. "Thomas was just updating me on the Versatech situation." Thomas, the company's legal counsel, had a serious demeanor that matched his salt and pepper hair. "Versatech is claiming they purchased the technology legally and had no knowledge of any impropriety on James's part." "Do we believe them?" Sarah asked. "Not for a second," Thomas replied. "Their CEO and James have been friends since college. The emails we recovered make it clear they knew the deal was unauthorized. What are our options? We can sue for the return of the intellectual property and damages, or we can negotiate a proper licensing agreement, one that actually benefits Miller Industries." Sarah considered this. What would be better for the company long term? A licensing agreement would bring in steady revenue and avoid a lengthy court battle, Robert said. "But it might appear that we're letting them get away with stealing from us. Unless," Sarah said slowly, "we structure the agreement to give us oversight of how our technology is implemented and require a public acknowledgement that the original deal was invalid." Thomas looked impressed. "That's actually an elegant solution. It gives us ongoing involvement without the PR nightmare of a corporate lawsuit." "Draft the proposal," Sarah instructed. "I'll review it before we approach Versatech." The doors opened as board members began arriving for the meeting. Sarah recognized most of them, her father's contemporaries who had known her before the accident. Some nodded politely, others watched her warily, still uncertain about her leadership. Among the last to enter was Ellen, James's wife. Sarah hadn't expected her to attend. "Ellen," she said, surprised. "I didn't realize you were on the board." "I'm not," Ellen replied coolly. "But as James's wife and a significant shareholder, I have the right to observe major board decisions. Unless you're planning to bar me?" "Of course not," Sarah said calmly, though her heart rate had quickened. Ellen had always been the more calculating half of the marriage, the one who had encouraged James's ambitions regardless of the moral cost. Robert called the meeting to order, and for the next hour they worked through routine business matters. Sarah presented her first-month assessment of the company, highlighting areas that needed immediate attention. Most notably, financial controls to prevent future embezzlement and a security overhaul for the R&D department. When she finished, Ellen raised her hand. "Ellen, may I ask a question?" Robert glanced at Sarah, who nodded. "These changes you're proposing," Ellen said, "they'll cost millions and disrupt operations. Haven't you caused enough damage already? Our stock has dropped 15% since you took over." "The stock dropped," Sarah replied evenly, "because your husband's crimes became public knowledge. The changes I'm proposing will prevent similar problems in the future." "Alleged crimes," Ellen corrected. "And speaking of allegations, how is everyone supposed to trust the judgment of someone with documented brain damage?" A tense silence fell over the room. Sarah could feel every eye on her, waiting to see how she would respond to the direct attack. "Ellen," Robert began, but Sarah held up her hand. "It's a fair question," she said, "one that deserves a clear answer." She stood and moved to the center of the room, where everyone could see her clearly. 15 years ago, I suffered a traumatic brain injury that affected my processing speed and caused some memory issues. These deficits were significant immediately after the accident, but improved with therapy and time. I developed different ways of thinking and analyzing information. Not worse, just different. She paused, making eye contact with each board member in turn. "What my family told you, what they told my father, was that I was permanently impaired and incapable of complex decision-making. That was a lie designed to remove me from my position as my father's heir. The evidence of this deception is now in your board packets, including the original medical reports and the altered versions my brother presented." She walked to the wall where the company's mission statement hung in an ornate frame. "Miller Industries was built on innovation," she continued. My father understood that different perspectives drive innovation. My brain works differently now. I see patterns others miss. I approach problems from angles others don't consider. That's not a liability. It's potentially our greatest asset. Ellen's smug expression had faltered, but she rallied quickly. Pretty words, but they don't change the fact that you have no business experience. You've spent the last decade working with horses and children, not running a corporation. I spent the last decade helping people with disabilities discover their strengths and build independence, Sarah corrected. I managed a program with 30 staff members and an annual budget of $2 million. We increased services by 40% while maintaining financial stability. She returned to her seat. But you're right about one thing. I don't have traditional corporate experience. That's why I've assembled an advisory team with decades of collective knowledge, and why I'm proposing we create a new position, Chief Innovation Officer, to be filled by someone with strong industry experience who can complement my skills. Robert nodded approvingly. That's an excellent suggestion. The board will take it under advisement. Ellen opened her mouth to argue further, but at that moment, the conference room door burst open. Margaret hurried in, looking uncharacteristically flustered. I apologize for the interruption, she said, but we have a situation. James has called a press conference at the Westfield Hotel. He's about to go live. Robert immediately turned on the large screen on the wall and found the local news channel. James stood at a podium, impeccably dressed and projecting confident concern. The caption beneath him read, Miller Heir challenges sister's takeover. Deeply concerned about the future of Miller Industries, James was saying. My sister is a kind and decent person who has struggled bravely with the limitations caused by her accident. But kindness isn't enough to lead a company with thousands of employees depending on its success. He looked directly into the camera. The board has refused to acknowledge the crisis of confidence among our investors and clients. That's why I'm announcing today that I've secured backing from Westwood Capital to make an offer for controlling interest in Miller Industries, a fair market value offer that would benefit all shareholders while ensuring stable leadership. The boardroom erupted in shocked conversation. Westwood Capital was one of the largest private equity firms in the country, known for acquiring companies, breaking them apart, and selling the profitable pieces. He's trying to force a sale, Thomas said grimly. If enough shareholders support it, they could outvote Sarah, Robert finished. Sarah felt the familiar fog of panic threatening to descend, the one she'd experienced in overwhelming situations since her accident. She closed her eyes briefly, using the centering technique Rachel had taught her. 3 deep breaths. Identify 5 things she could see. The polished table, Robert's concerned face, the screen with James still speaking, the company logo on the wall, Ellen's triumphant smile. Ellen, of course. You knew about this, Sarah said, turning to her sister-in-law. That's why you came today. To distract us while James made his move. Ellen's smile widened. My husband is trying to save this company from someone who isn't qualified to run it. The shareholders will agree. Maybe, Robert said grimly. The stock drop has made many of them nervous. Sarah studied Ellen's confident expression and suddenly understood. This isn't about saving the company. If Westwood acquires Miller Industries, what happens to the evidence against James? The financial records, the emails, everything stored on company servers? A new owner would have no interest in pursuing old allegations, Thomas realized. They'd want to settle everything quietly and move on. Exactly, Sarah said. This isn't a rescue. It's an erasure. She turned to Robert. We need to talk to the shareholders immediately. Show them what's really happening. That will take time, Robert said. Westwood works fast. They could have offers out by tomorrow. Sarah thought quickly. Then we need to be faster. Thomas, can you get an emergency injunction based on the ongoing investigation into James's activities? Possibly, but courts move slowly. What about the press? Margaret suggested. James is using the media. Why can't we? Sarah hesitated. She'd spent years avoiding attention, protecting her privacy. Going public would mean exposing not just James's crimes, but her own struggles, opening herself to scrutiny and judgment. It's risky, Robert warned, reading her expression. Once you step into the public eye, you can't control the narrative. I can try, Sarah said, making her decision. Margaret, call Diane Lewis at the Business Journal. She's been trying to get an interview since the will reading. Tell her I can meet her in 30 minutes. As the board meeting dissolved into urgent action, Ellen rose to leave. This won't work, she said. No one will believe you over James. He's been the face of this company for 15 years. You're right about one thing, Sarah replied. This is about trust, but you and James made a critical mistake. What's that? You underestimated me. Again. 2 hours later, Sarah sat across from Diane Lewis, a sharp-eyed reporter in her 50s who had covered Miller Industries since before Sarah's accident. They were using George Miller's home office for the interview, a setting that visually connected Sarah to her father's legacy. Thank you for meeting on such short notice, Diane said, setting up her recorder. I have to say, I've been hoping to hear your side of this story for weeks. I believe in letting actions speak first, Sarah replied, but today's events require a more direct response. The interview began with basic questions about Sarah's background and her father's decision to leave her the company. Then Diane turned to more difficult territory. Your brother has publicly questioned your ability to lead Miller Industries due to cognitive deficits from your accident. How do you respond to those concerns? Sarah had prepared for this question with Rachel's help. My accident changed how my brain processes information, but it didn't diminish my intelligence or judgment. I approach problems differently now, sometimes taking longer to process details, but often seeing connections others miss. She leaned forward slightly. The truth is, diversity of thought is valuable in leadership. My different cognitive style has already helped identify inefficiencies and opportunities that were previously overlooked. Can you give an example? When reviewing our supply chain, I noticed patterns indicating we could reduce shipping costs by 15% by reconfiguring our distribution centers. Our traditional analysis had missed this because it followed conventional logistics models that I wasn't limited by. Diane nodded, making notes. Your brother announced today that Westwood Capital is preparing an offer for the company. Do shareholders have reason to consider it? Shareholders should always consider their options, Sarah said carefully, but they should do so with complete information. She placed a folder on the table between them. These documents show why my brother is so eager to see control of the company change hands. They include evidence of systematic embezzlement and unauthorized sale of proprietary technology to competitors. Diane's eyes widened as she scanned the contents. These are serious allegations. They're more than allegations. The board has verified their authenticity, and we've already filed reports with the SEC. My brother isn't trying to save Miller Industries. He's trying to save himself. Why are you sharing this with me now? Sarah met the reporter's gaze steadily. Because I believe in transparency. For 15 years, secrets and lies shaped my life and damaged this company. That ends now. After the interview, Sarah felt drained but relieved. She had spoken her truth, regardless of the outcome. As Rachel drove her back to the office, Sarah's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Miss Miller, this is Edward Westwood from Westwood Capital. Sarah gestured for Rachel to pull over. Mr. Westwood, I didn't expect to hear from you directly. I prefer to handle delicate situations personally, he replied. His voice was smooth, cultured. Your brother approached us with an interesting opportunity regarding Miller Industries. So I heard. What he failed to mention were the legal complications currently surrounding the company and his own actions. Had we known, we might have been more cautious in our approach. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. I appreciate your candor. Likewise, I appreciate the documentation your legal counsel forwarded this afternoon. Very thorough. It seems we may have been misled about certain aspects of Miller Industries' situation. My brother is skilled at presenting selective information, Sarah said carefully. Indeed. There was a pause. In light of these revelations, Westwood Capital will be withdrawing our interest in acquiring Miller Industries. We wish you success in your new role. After ending the call, Sarah sat in stunned silence. Good news? Rachel asked. Westwood is backing out, Sarah said. Thomas must have sent them the evidence files. That's brilliant. It's only temporary, Sarah warned. James won't give up, and we still have the shareholder meeting next week. But for the first time since becoming CEO, Sarah felt truly confident. She had faced public scrutiny and survived. She had outmaneuvered her brother's latest attempt to control the narrative. Most importantly, she had begun to trust her own judgment, her different, valuable way of seeing the world. As they pulled into the company parking lot, Sarah noticed a group of employees watching her through the lobby windows. A month ago, their scrutiny would have made her shrink into herself, assuming judgment and doubt. Today, she straightened her shoulders and walked toward them with purpose. One by one, they nodded in acknowledgement, not just of her position, but of her growing authority. Sarah Miller was no longer the forgotten daughter or the damaged outsider. She was becoming exactly what her father had seen in her, a leader worth believing in. 6 months had passed since the reading of George Miller's will. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sarah's office, autumn painted the Westfield skyline in reds and golds. She stood watching the view, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, reflecting on how much had changed. The door opened softly, and Margaret entered with a tablet. The quarterly reports are ready for your review, she said, and Dr. Rivera is here for your 10 o'clock. Send him in, Sarah replied, moving to her desk. She'd redecorated the office, keeping her father's antique desk, but replacing the dark wood paneling with warmer colors and adding comfortable seating in the corner for more collaborative meetings. Dr. Michael Rivera entered with an enthusiastic handshake. As the newly appointed Chief Innovation Officer, he brought decades of industry experience and boundless energy to the role. Sarah, wait until you see these results, he said, setting up his laptop. The adaptive interface we developed based on your accessibility. Recommendations isn't just helping employees with processing differences. It's increasing overall productivity by 23%. Sarah smiled. One of her first initiatives had been to create technology that accommodated different cognitive styles, inspired by the tools she'd used in her own recovery. What had started as an internal project was now poised to become a marketable product. The development team wants to call it Miller Mindways, Michael added, as a tribute to your father. He would have liked that, Sarah said softly, though he wouldn't have taken credit for it. As Michael walked her through the project details, Sarah noted how easily they worked together now. His rapid-fire thinking complemented her more methodical approach. Where she saw patterns, he saw applications. Together, they were transforming Miller Industries from a traditional manufacturing company into an innovation leader. After the meeting, Sarah reviewed the quarterly financials. The company had weathered the storm of negative publicity following James's arrest and had emerged stronger. Stock prices were up 30% from their lowest point, and a strategic partnership with Versatech, negotiated on Sarah's terms, had opened new markets for both companies. The intercom buzzed. Sarah, Robert Hastings is here to see you, Margaret announced. Robert entered, looking more relaxed than Sarah had ever seen him. Semi-retirement suited him, though he remained chairman of the board. Just checking in before the dedication ceremony, he said, taking a seat across from her. How are you feeling about today? Nervous, Sarah admitted. Public speaking still isn't my favorite activity. You've gotten quite good at it, he observed. That speech at the shareholders' meeting last month impressed even your critics. Sarah had indeed found her voice over the past 6 months, though she still prepared meticulously for every presentation, working with Rachel to organize her thoughts in ways that complemented her processing style. Is there any word on James? Robert asked carefully. Sarah nodded. The plea deal was finalized yesterday. 4 years in a minimum security facility, full restitution to the company, and he's permanently barred from serving as an officer in any public company. How do you feel about that? She considered the question. Relieved it's over. Sad for what might have been. My brother had genuine talents. He just chose to use them selfishly. And Ellen? Divorce proceedings are underway. She's moved to Chicago. Sarah shook her head slightly. She still believes I manipulated my way into this position. Some people can't accept when they've been wrong, Robert said. Your father made the same mistake for years, but at least he recognized the truth before it was too late. Sarah glanced at the framed photograph on her desk, herself and her father on his sailboat when she was 16, before the accident changed everything. She'd found it among his personal effects, a reminder of happier times. We should head downstairs, she said, gathering her notes for the ceremony. I don't want to be late. In the lobby of Miller Industries headquarters, a crowd had gathered. Employees, board members, community leaders, and the press stood chatting as they waited for the dedication to begin. A large object stood in the center of the space, covered by a blue cloth. Sarah moved through the crowd, greeting people by name. She'd made a point of connecting with employees at all levels, and the effort had paid off in loyalty and increased morale. Near the refreshment table, she spotted a familiar face. Rachel, I wasn't sure you could make it. Sarah embraced her friend warmly. I wouldn't miss it, Rachel replied. Besides, I wanted to hear how the meeting went with the foundation board. They approved all our grant proposals, Sarah said, including the special fund for brain injury survivors returning to work. The George Miller Foundation had been Sarah's most personal project, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting people with cognitive differences and changing perceptions about their capabilities in the workplace. Funded by a percentage of Miller Industries' profits, it was already making an impact across the country. A soft chime indicated it was time for the ceremony to begin. Sarah moved to the podium, taking a moment to organize her notes before looking up at the assembled crowd. 6 months ago, this many eyes on her would have triggered anxiety. Today, she felt only a calm sense of purpose. Thank you all for being here, she began. Today marks an important milestone for Miller Industries, not just the completion of our headquarters renovation, but a renewal of our commitment to innovation and inclusion. She gestured to the covered object. This new installation represents the values that will guide us forward. But before we unveil it, I want to share a story that many of you haven't heard. Sarah stepped out from behind the podium, preferring to speak directly to the audience. When I was 23, I had my life planned out. I was finishing medical school, preparing to join my father in leading this company and looking forward to a bright future. Then came the accident, a car crash that left me with a traumatic brain injury. She paused, letting the words settle. Overnight, everything changed. Not just my cognitive abilities, but how people perceived me. Where they once saw potential, they now saw limitation. My father, influenced by those around him, came to believe I was no longer capable of the future we had planned. Sarah moved closer to the audience, making eye contact with individuals as she spoke. For 15 years, I lived within the boundaries others set for me. I built a meaningful life helping people at a therapeutic riding center, but I did it believing I wasn't capable of more, because that's what I had been told, over and over, until I accepted it as truth. She glanced at the portrait of her father that hung in the lobby. What I didn't know was that my father eventually recognized his mistake. In the last months of his life, he discovered not only my brother's betrayal, but the truth about my capabilities. His decision to leave me this company wasn't charity. It was recognition of potential that had been ignored for too long. Sarah returned to the podium. The past 6 months haven't been easy. Taking leadership of Miller Industries meant facing public scrutiny, legal battles, and deeply personal challenges. But it also meant discovering that my different way of thinking isn't a liability. It's a strength that brings new perspectives to old problems. She gestured to Michael Rivera and the development team standing nearby. That discovery led directly to our newest product line, adaptive interfaces that support diverse cognitive styles in the workplace. What began as accommodations for my own processing differences has evolved into technology that benefits everyone by recognizing that minds work in different ways. Sarah nodded to Margaret, who pressed a button. The blue cloth fell away, revealing a striking glass sculpture. Lines of light within the glass created a complex neural network pattern that shifted and changed colors subtly, representing the dynamic nature of the human brain. This installation is called Connections, Sarah explained. It represents our commitment to seeing differences not as deficits, but as opportunities for innovation. Each unique neural pathway creates possibilities we might otherwise miss. She paused, emotion making her voice softer. My father built this company on the belief that progress comes from seeing what others don't. I'm proud to continue that legacy by creating a place where different perspectives aren't just tolerated, but valued, where we recognize that the most powerful insights often come from unexpected sources. The crowd applauded warmly. As the formal ceremony concluded and people moved closer to examine the sculpture, Sarah found herself approached by a young woman in a wheelchair. Ms. Miller? The woman said hesitantly. I'm Jessica Torres. I just started in the marketing department last month. Of course, Sarah replied, remembering their brief introduction at a new employee orientation. How are you settling in? That's what I wanted to thank you for, Jessica said. The adaptive software you implemented made all the difference. At my last job, I was constantly struggling to keep up with the workflow because of my multiple sclerosis. Here, I can actually show what I'm capable of. That's exactly what we're aiming for, Sarah said warmly. It's more than the technology, Jessica continued. It's knowing that the person in charge understands that different doesn't mean less. After the ceremony, Sarah returned to her office to find David Chen waiting with a small wrapped package. I found this while we were organizing the company archives, he explained. I thought you should have it. Sarah unwrapped the package to find a small wooden box containing a compass, tarnished silver with her initials engraved on the back. Your father had this made for your 25th birthday, David said. After you were no longer with the company, he kept it in his desk drawer. I think he was waiting for the right time to give it to you. Sarah ran her fingers over the cool metal, feeling the weight of what might have been, and what still could be. Thank you, David, she said quietly. Left alone, Sarah moved to the window, compass in hand. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city where she had once felt like a stranger. Now she was reconnected, to her father's legacy, to her own potential, and to a future she was actively shaping. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Dinner tonight to celebrate? The whole advisory board wants to toast your 6-month anniversary as CEO. Sarah smiled and typed back, Absolutely. I'll meet you there at 7. She placed the compass on her desk beside the photo of herself and her father. For years after her accident, she had felt lost, navigating a world that constantly reminded her of what she couldn't do. Now she had found her direction, not by becoming who she had been before, but by embracing who she was now. The quarterly reports waited for her review, and emails demanded attention, but Sarah took one more moment to appreciate how far she had come. From the woman who had arrived at the will reading 6 months ago, expecting nothing and prepared to leave with only her father's bird-watching journals, to the leader who had transformed both a company and perceptions about cognitive differences. Her father's final gift hadn't been the company itself, but the opportunity to reclaim her own narrative, to replace a story of limitation with one of possibility. As Sarah finally turned to her work, she caught sight of her reflection in the window glass. The uncertain woman who had stepped off a bus in Westfield 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself with quiet confidence. Someone who had discovered that true strength often emerges only after we've been broken and remade. Outside her office, Miller Industries hummed with activity, people creating, solving problems, building the future. And at its center was Sarah Miller, once dismissed as deficient, now recognized for the unique perspective that made her not just capable, but exceptional. The compass on her desk pointed north, steady and true. After 15 years of detours, Sarah Miller had finally found her way home.